Good morning. So, I said this first service, Landon Wyatt will be proud of me. I'm starting off the sermon with a Maisie story. So, Maisie's my daughter, and she is a whole lot of things, but if you ask her, she says that she is a right now kind of girl. And that is a true statement. Patience is a virtue that she really, really has to work on. And I think it becomes obvious whenever we mention things. Like anytime we have a plan, we have to keep it a secret from Maisie. Because as soon as she hears about the plan, that sounds fun, let's do it right now. Waiting is difficult for that girl. In fact, there's many a night, bedtime is the worst. There's many a night where I'm laying on the floor next to her bed and she is in her bed frantically asking, is it tomorrow yet? Is it tomorrow yet? Is it tomorrow yet? And I think the impatience, the difficulty waiting came to a head a couple weeks ago. We were driving back from Central Arkansas. We had a trip where Molly took the kids down, and then I met her halfway, and then I drove down and visited with my parents, and then I brought the kids back. So it was just me alone in the car with the little ones for the 2.5 hours back from Central Arkansas. And as soon as we left Central Arkansas, Maisie asked for us to go back. She wanted to go back to Grandmama and Grandpapa's as soon as we left. And without thinking, I told her that we would go back, meaning eventually we would go back. And when I didn't stop the car and turn around, she lost her marbles. And so I'm trying to drive, and she's in the back. Why can't we go back? Why can't we go back? Why can't we go back? Trying to focus on the road, trying to drown it out, telling her not to be any louder because she's going to wake up her siblings, praying that she would fall asleep too. She's gotten to the point where she's so deep into it that it's like almost a sing-song, crying, scream. Can we go back? Why can't we go back? Why can't we go back? And it gets quiet. It gets quieter and quieter, and I think she might be falling asleep, and she screams. It was the scream that kids make when they're hurt. If you're a parent, you know what I'm talking about. It's a different kind of scream than a complaining scream or a crying scream or I didn't get my way scream. It is something is hurting me. And so I'm pulling the van over as I yell to the back, Maisie, what's wrong? What's wrong? And she answers, you're breaking my heart to pieces, and now all the pieces are getting lost. A little bit dramatic, a little bit laughable, extremely frustrating. But she calmed down, and we made it to Northwest Arkansas. Doing some research just recently, I found out that there is a good chance, it's laughable, and it's very frustrating for a kid who can't wait, but there is a very good chance that time is experienced different for small children than it is for adults. They just experience time slower. This was an idea that was popularized by Paul Genet. He's a French philosopher. And the idea is that we don't experience time the same way because like most things in our life, our experience is based on things that we've already experienced. So when we experience something new, it's always relative to something else. And so the way that we experience time is compared to the time that we've experienced so far. And so as you've lived more and more and more of your life, that moment in time seems smaller and smaller and smaller in comparison. Just to give you an idea, Maisie turned 5 at the beginning of the month, and now she's waiting for her 6th birthday. She has to wait a whole nother year. For her to wait that year is literally waiting a fifth of how long she's been alive. 20% of her current life, she is going to wait for her next birthday. Jump ahead when you're 50 and you're waiting for your 51st birthday, that's only 2% of your life so far. Very, very small in comparison. Just kind of give you a perspective, 50 waiting for your 51st birthday, to experience the same amount of time waiting, a fifth of your lifetime so far, you would have to wait a whole decade for your next birthday. And so we get this idea that kids are waiting longer for for the same kind of thing that we adults are waiting a shorter time for. And we get that feeling, right? Every year seems to pass by a little bit faster. For me as a teacher, it's every summer passes by a little bit faster. Every year, a little bit quicker. There's been an idea for a while, and in researching this idea, I came across a YouTube channel. It's a really interesting YouTube channel. I think we could work it into a series. But the YouTube channel is called Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. And this guy that created it, John Koenig, he designs words and creates a video to help convey this feeling or emotion. And so the word that he came up with for this sense of waiting and how waiting changes throughout life is xenosign. And I've got a quick video for you guys to watch. Check this out.
Xenosign. It's actually just after you're born that life flashes before your eyes. Entire eons are lived in those first few months when you feel inseparable from the world itself, with nothing to do but watch it passing by. At first, time is only felt vicariously, as something that happens to other people. You get used to living in the moment because there's nowhere else to go. But soon enough, life begins to move, and you learn to move with it. And you take it for granted that you're a different person every year, upgraded with a different body, a different future. You run around so fast, the world around you seems to stand still, until a summer vacation can stretch on for an eternity. And you start to feel time moving forward, learning its rhythm. But now and then it skips a beat, as if your birthday arrives one day earlier every year. We should consider the idea that youth is not wasted on the young, that their dramas are no more grand than they should be, that their emotions make perfect sense once you adjust for inflation. So for someone going through adolescence, life feels epic and tragic simply because it is. Every kink in your day could easily warp the arc of your story, because each year is worth a little less than the last. And with each birthday, we circle back and cross the same point around the sun, and wish each other many happy returns. But soon you feel the circle begin to tighten, and you realize it's a spiral, and you're already halfway through. As more of your day repeats itself, you start to cast off dead weight, and feel the steady pull toward your center of gravity, the ballast of memories you hold on to, until it all seems to move under its own inertia. So even when you sit still, it feels like you're running somewhere. And even if tomorrow you'll run a little faster and stretch your arms a little farther, you'll still feel the seconds slipping away as you drift around the bend. Life is short and life is long, but not in that order.
You guys get this idea of these moments of waiting seem to speed up as we get older and older and older. And then somewhere along the way, you make this transition, and the things that you wait for become more significant because there is an end. There's an end to the waiting. There's a point where you won't be waiting for anything anymore, right? That day of your death at the end gets closer and closer. And so maybe things become more and more significant. And when you think about these kind of things, like if your doctor told you that you had 2 days to live, would you change the way you live the next 48 hours? And if you answered that as yes, then why aren't you just living that way? Right? We don't have any guarantee for the amount of time that we're going to be alive. We just get to experience one moment to the next. I think this idea of waiting and then the imminence of death as it approaches, it causes a lot of people to look back on their past, right? To remember those good moments that they had, the nostalgia throughout the years. And for others, it might make them look back at all the regrets they have in life, things that they wish they would have done differently. It's interesting that here in this passage in the Hall of Faith, we get so many people's perspective at their deathbed. And that's going to happen again today. We're actually stepping back from Moses to Joseph. And Joseph's story is interesting. Joseph takes up a quarter of the book of Genesis, just his life and the things that happened to him. And then he gets one verse in the Hall of Faith. And that verse takes place right at the end. Let's read it, Hebrews 11:22. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Isn't it interesting? The author jumped to that moment. I think, it's important for us to realize, this book is called Hebrews, not because that's a catchy title for a book or because that's the place that it falls in our New Testament. It's called Hebrews because it was a letter that was written to the Hebrews. And so when they hear about these characters, an entire history comes up, an entire story passes through their heads. See, the Israelite people, they're intimately acquainted with their history. It's part of their education, memorizing these stories. And so I'm sure when the readers read, by faith, Joseph, they couldn't help but expect some things to be said. Because Joseph's story is so interesting. You really should take the time to read it for yourself, but they probably expected something like, by faith, Joseph trusted God when he was sold into slavery by his brothers. Because that happened, and he didn't lose heart. Or maybe they expected, by faith, Joseph remained pure in the face of his slave master's wife trying to seduce him. If you don't get that, it's because you're too old. It's for the young ones. Or maybe they expected, by faith, Joseph continued to trust God as he was falsely accused and imprisoned for years because he didn't lose heart. Or maybe by faith, Joseph trusted God when he interpreted Pharaoh's dream and was placed as second in command of all of Egypt. Or by faith, Joseph forgave his brothers and saved his whole family from starving to death. Those would have all been great points for the writer to make. But no, the writer of Hebrews goes immediately to the end of Joseph's life. We read this scene for the first time in Genesis chapter 50. At the end, Joseph said to his brothers, I'm ready to die. God will most certainly pay you a visit and take you out of this land and back to the land he so solemnly promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then Jacob made the sons of Israel promise under oath, when God makes his visitation, make sure you take my bones with you as you leave here. And Joseph died at age 110 years. They embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt. So Joseph's last words weren't filled with regret. There was no nostalgia. There was no bringing up memories. The words on his deathbed revealed his trust, his continued trust and dependence and confidence that God would come through on this promise. And this is a weird promise. It takes an enormous amount of faith. Joseph is relying on a promise that was made to Abraham almost 300 years before this scene takes place. God made a promise to Abraham. And that's what he's talking about when he says God will pay you a visit and take you out of this land and back to the land he's promised. If you want to read it, we're not going to go through it, but you can find it in Genesis chapter 13. Almost 300 years ago, before this, a promise was made to Abraham. Abraham died without seeing the fulfillment of that promise, but he passed on that promise to his son, Isaac. And Isaac lived his whole life, and he died without seeing the fulfillment of this promise. And he passed it on to his son, Jacob. And Jacob lived his whole life and didn't see the fulfillment of this promise and passed it on to Joseph. And now Joseph is at the end of his life, passing it on to his children. Doesn't know when that it is going to happen. He just knows that it definitely will. And so that's what he's looking forward to. So I want to pull 2 points, I think, out of what the writer of Hebrews is trying to make right here. Because he really brings up 2 things about Joseph. That Joseph is talking about the Exodus, and that he gives instructions on his bones. And so the first point would be that faith forms our thoughts. Joseph was confident that God was going to keep his promise. That's why he was talking about the Exodus. That's why he said, surely God will. He didn't know how, he didn't know when, but he knew it was going to happen. He knew that God's promise to take these people home was truth. And I think it's important to point out, I think it's important a lot, because I think a lot of things are important. Joseph's kids had to be like, what are you talking about, Dad? Because his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and their sons, his grandkids, they were there. They were all around the deathbed. And Joseph's like, hey, when you guys leave, be sure and take my bones with you. These kids have to have thought, like, what do you mean when we leave? Like, there is no reason to leave Egypt. Joseph was second in command, so he held a pretty high position. It's reasonable to think that his children would be in high positions as well. His family were landowners where they came from. They were probably landowners here. We know for a fact that Joseph was well off because his body was embalmed, and that was not something that just a common Egyptian had the luxury of doing. Most Egyptians were just buried in the desert with some things to carry them over into the afterlife. You had to put up some money to get embalmed. And so his kids would be like, why, Dad, why in the world would we ever leave this place? But Joseph had faith that that was going to happen. And so I think, it's easy for us sometimes to have faith or to trust in God when things are going tough. When you got that metaphorical storm brewing, you can tell some bad things are on their way, and you pray that all too familiar prayer like, God, if you get me out of this, I'm going to serve you for my whole life. I'm going to give 110% from this day on. Or, God, if you just take this thing away, then I will, and then you fill in the blanks, however you need that prayer to go. And so I think it's easy for us to think about what God's going to do and look ahead to the better times when times are tough. But Joseph never lost sight of that promise that God had, right? From in the day when he was sold into slavery by his family, by his own brothers, never lost sight of that promise. To being sold into slavery and being falsely accused and imprisoned for years, never lost sight of that promise. Always looking ahead. To when he was made second in control of all of Egypt, never lost sight of the promise. Even on the day when his dreams literally came true and his family were bowing before him, he knew that wasn't the promise that God had intended. He was always looking ahead. It reminds me of this show that I saw a couple years ago. The whole premise of the show is they send this guy, he's a comedian, but they send him all over the world to all these exotic destinations. And I think that would be like a dream job for most people. You just get to go places and they film you. But the entertaining value behind the show is that he didn't want to go. As soon as he left home, he was thinking about and talking about how comfortable his bed was and how much better the food was back home. And he went to some pretty awesome places and probably enjoyed himself. He went to some pretty horrible places too. But the whole time that he was there, he was thinking about home. And the premise of the show is he was complaining the whole time. And I don't think we should complain, but that should be our attitude, right? We're sojourners, refugees. We're just traveling. This isn't our permanent destination. And so we should always be thinking about how much better it is back home. How much more comfortable the bed is back home. So when things are bad and life is difficult and we're surrounded by death and destruction and corruption and everything that you would ever label as bad, we should long for home where all that stuff is gone. But at the same time, when things are good and we're surrounded by wealth and prosperity and health and wholeness and anything you could ever imagine to label as good, we should still long for home, where all that stuff is even more. And then the second thing that I think it brings out, because he said he talked about the Exodus, thought about going home, but it also says he left instructions for his bones. And so I think that means that faith should also shape our actions. Have you guys ever heard the phrase, they're too heavenly minded to be any earthly good? Maybe that's like an old school Christianese thing. Too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. I said this first service. In a previous life, I was involved in grad school in physics, so I was spending time with some pretty non-religious people. And oftentimes they brought that up. Like, as a Christian, how could you care about anything here, right? If you're always looking forward to that mansion and the streets of gold and the sweet by and by, like, why would you ever be concerned with things like the poor or the environment or saving money or empathy for another person? Why not just hedge your bets and wait it out if that's your ultimate destination? And I think his story kind of makes the point. Joseph could have easily done that, right? He wasn't commanded by God to save the Egyptians. God did gift him with the interpretation of the dream, Pharaoh's dream. You got to read the story. I'm leaving out so many details. But he wasn't commanded to save the Egyptians. And so he could have lived out his promise, right? He could have gone back home. Like, he's second in command. So as soon as everyone looks away, like, he could have dipped out of there and gone home. But he didn't. He stuck around, and he made sure that there was provision for the Egyptians. And in that, his dream ended up being fulfilled. I don't think he could have ever seen that when it happened, but God worked through his sacrifice of staying there and helping the people that he had been slaves to. He was counted as righteous. He was said by faith because he was looking forward to this city, like we read in the same chapter, a city whose designer and builder is God. And then even in death, Joseph continued to have confidence of this destination, right? In the very last thing I think you could literally do, not you, but like where your body is laid, that'd be the last thing, right? He wanted to make sure that last thing was take my bones with you when you leave, because I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen, and I want to go with you. Joseph's bones made it to the promised land. Moses didn't, but Joseph's bones made it to the promised land. Can you imagine when the Israelites were enslaved to the Egyptians? That had to kind of be a little bit of a beacon of hope, right? Joseph's bones weren't buried because one day we're getting out of here. And he told us we need to take his bones with us. Even in his death, his actions spoke of that promise and that confidence. And we start to get this idea that maybe our ultimate earthly good is being heavenly minded. Jesus talks about it in Matthew chapter 6. Therefore, do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added to you. So tonight, we're celebrating our graduates. We're going to have a banquet up here at the church. These two girls, they're starting a process of moving away from home to a temporary home. Hopefully. Their parents are hoping it's temporary. Right? They're exiles at college. They're sojourners. That's not where they're from, and it's not where they're staying. And so what do? As they get ready, they take things from home, right? They take pictures of their family. They take posters from their bedroom. They take sheets and blankets that smell familiar, and they set up a little home in their temporary home. And so then you get some dorm rooms that stand in stark contrast to each other because these two kids are from vastly different homes. And so that made me think, what's it look like when we start decorating our earthly dorm room to look like our heavenly home? We don't want to wait it out. You don't want to sit in a bland dorm room for 4 years while you go through college. So while we're waiting for the promise to come true, and we decorate this temporary home to look like our permanent home, what does that look like? To make this world a place that looks like the place where there is no death, no crying, no destruction, no corruption, only wholeness and love and joy. We're working in the world around us to make this temporary home look like that. So how are you waiting? What does waiting look like? And I think it's different. We're all in different places. So what our waiting looks like is different. But as the years pass faster and faster, are you hunkering down and waiting it out? Are you allowing faith to reshape the way that you think and the way that you do, to reshape your thoughts and your actions? You know, there's that great song, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." But the things that we do now echo into the future. And this is the beginning of eternity for all of us. So let's decorate our dorm room. Let's pray.